USB-C on iPhone is a big deal, but what's even bigger is the implication that it has on iPhone as a whole. Based on Apple's implementation of USB-C, as well as some of the other things they discussed during the keynote, Apple is planning a pretty interesting future for the iPhone, but in order to understand this, we need to first go back to 2018. 2018 was the year that Apple released the iPhone XS lineup. At this point, Apple introduced the iPhone XR as a more quote-unquote budget-friendly iPhone since there was so much backlash over the iPhone X's $300 price increase. But it was the iPhone 11 lineup in particular that was going to shake things up in a pretty interesting way. Rather than position the budget iPhone 11 as the budget option, Apple instead chose to position it as just the iPhone 11, the base model. That's it. The real upgrade that year was the 11 Pro, as this was the direct successor to the XS. Same phones pretty much, just a shift in naming. But this did end up creating a little bit of a problem because Apple intended for the Pro name to be sort of an indicator that it was the better version of the base iPhone 11. But what it actually did was lead people to wonder whether the Pro iPhone was actually intended for professionals. The Verge wrote, quote, "Semantically, the Pro title is less about being a device specifically for professionals and more about applying the mystique of the modern creative professional to imply that the new version is better than the regular version. In other words, Pro doesn't necessarily mean pro, it just means better." This trend continued on for the next few years, with Apple still positioning the Pro models as pretty much just the better version of the base model. But then, 2023 changed everything. This was officially the year that Apple was fully positioning the Pro lineup as devices specifically targeted for professional photographers and videographers. Enter the iPhone 15 Pro, complete with professional color grading, direct recording to a Mac or external storage drive, and above all, a USB-C port with USB 3 speeds powered by the A17 Pro chipset. And what was significant about this change in particular was that Apple was given the base iPhone 15 slower USB speeds. In fact, the USB-C ports on the base iPhone are effectively just Lightning ports shaped like USB-C. But it's details like this that show us what Apple really has planned for the future. Everything that Apple touted, professional color grading standards, AV1 decoders, focal lengths in the camera app, recording in ProRAW at 4K 60, USB 3.0 speeds, all of this shows us that Apple truly wants to make the iPhone a professional device, effectively separating the base iPhone from the Pro. But that being said, even if you're not a professional, Apple still wants to sell you a Pro model. They weren't shy about advertising the next generation of mobile gaming that they announced with the iPhone 15 Pro, and even with all the focus toward professionals, Apple still wants to entice the average buyer to stick with the Pro models. I actually went into this topic further in this video right here, where I also talk about 3 other things that Apple has planned for the future of the iPhone, so go check that video out next, and I'll see you over there. Adios. After what feels like forever, Apple finally announced the updated iMac with the M3 processor, but at face value, it looks as if nothing's changed, even down to the promotional material that they use on their website. So why should anyone care? Well, in this video, we're going to discuss why the new iMac is more significant than you think, what the new M3 iMac is bringing to the table, as well as another awesome addition to the Mac lineup that Apple announced. First off, why is the new iMac so important? Well, after Apple came out with the M1 iMac in 2021, it made sense that we'd eventually be getting an M2 iMac as well as an updated Mac Pro in the coming months. But unfortunately, this didn't really seem to be the case. In March of 2022, Apple announced the release of the Mac Studio and the Studio Display. This was the first time in a while that Apple was expanding their Mac lineup, and the Studio Display was Apple's first monitor targeted toward consumers instead of professionals. On top of all this, not only did Apple never come out with the M2 iMacs, but they even discontinued the iMac Pros, so it almost kind of seemed like at this point that they were starting to phase out the iMacs in favor of their desktop Macs. But things have been changing lately, because not only have we been getting rumors of an iMac Pro running on Apple Silicon coming out in the next year or two, but just a few days ago, Apple announced that they had finally updated the 24-inch iMac. Sort of. At first glance, it kind of looks like nothing's really changed. Apple even uses the same promotional material they used for the M1 iMac on their website. But there are some upgrades. First and foremost, the new M3 chip is touting it supposedly up to double the performance speeds over M1, as well as up to a 20% increase over the M2. 9to5Mac's benchmark tests do confirm that 20% increase over M2, but the increase over M1 is more like 30 to 35%. Second, the M3 chip brings the new ray tracing features that came out on the iPhone 15, so hopefully this should help create some more realistic lighting in 3D programs and games. Finally, the iMac now has support for Wi-Fi 6E, which theoretically should be about double the speed of Wi-Fi 6. Of course, the most significant part of all this is that Apple has shown they still have a vested interest in keeping the iMac lineup alive, so if you've been holding out on upgrading one for yourself, then this might be the time to do it. Even though the M3 iMac isn't the most exciting upgrade from a feature standpoint, it's actually not the only new thing Apple released this week. Before we talk about that, I would really appreciate it if you would consider subscribing to the channel, because that lets me know that you enjoy this style of content, and it lets you get more content like this straight to your feed. But moving forward, the M3 MacBook Pros also got announced alongside the new iMacs, and these seem to be the much more interesting option of the two for a few reasons. First off, this is the first time in forever that MacBook Pros finally have a new color option. If you go for the M3 Pro or the M3 Max models, Apple's replaced the space gray color with a new space black. Yes, that's right, MacBook Pros finally have a matte black option. Now, Apple does say that they have some kind of quantum anodizing fusion injection system that prevents fingerprints from showing up on the outside, but matte black finishes in general kind of have a bit of a history for being fingerprint magnets, so only time will tell if any of that'll help. Second of all, we also have new performance upgrades, and supposedly the M3 Max is even more powerful than the M2 Ultra from the Mac Studio. Plus, the M3 Max now supports up to 128 gigabytes of RAM, up from 96. Also, they support the same mesh rendering and ray tracing as the new M3 iMacs, and the displays are about 20% brighter. Finally, the Touch Bar MacBook Pro has been completely redesigned to fit in with the other two MacBook Pros as essentially a lower-end version of the 14.2-inch model. This has two USB-C ports rather than three, along with the base M3 processor. But other than that, everything else is pretty much the same. Unfortunately, the M3 MacBook Pros don't get the space black colorway like the M3 Pro and Maxes do, but on the plus side, they do start at $1,600 rather than $2,000, which makes it great for anyone who wants a MacBook Pro at a more affordable price. Let me know what you think of the new Macs down in the comments, and also be sure to leave a comment and let me know if you plan to get any of these Macs for yourself. In the meantime, thanks for watching, and I'll see you all around. Adios. Rumors about the Galaxy S24 Ultra have been swirling around for months now, and all of this that we've been hearing so far sounds suspiciously familiar. Because if the rumors are true, the Galaxy S24 Ultra might be taking a surprising number of cues from the iPhone 15 Pro. But what features does Samsung have in mind, and more importantly, can they implement them as well as Apple did on the iPhone? First and foremost, let's talk about one of the most notable upgrades to the iPhone 15, the titanium build. This was a pretty big deal for Apple because it solved a lot of the weight complaints that people had about the past iPhone Pros. By switching to titanium, Apple was able to shave off about 20 grams. Now that's not a massive difference, at least on paper, but once you're actually holding it in your hand, it's definitely a lot more noticeable. And while Samsung is planning to follow suit on the Galaxy S24 Ultra, it might not be as beneficial as you think. According to current rumors about the Galaxy S24 Ultra, a titanium build would technically make it lighter, but only about by 1 gram. Yeah, 1 gram. Now keep in mind, when Apple came out with their own titanium build, they really switched from stainless steel to titanium, but with Samsung, they'll be switching from aluminum, so with Samsung, you're pretty much just switching from one lightweight metal to another. But aside from this, Apple really went all in on trying to give the iPhone Pro a solid camera upgrade, and for the first time in a really long time, we got an actual proper upgrade for the zoom cameras. But apparently, Samsung might also be following suit and giving a major upgrade for their own zoom cameras. Instead of using the normal 12 megapixel 3x zoom lenses that they've used in the past, they'll instead be switching it out for a 50 megapixel camera. And this will supposedly allow the Ultra's space zoom to be extended from 100 times to 150 times. Now, if there's one thing that Samsung is really focused on their phones for years at this point, and something that they've kind of become known for on their phones, is their displays. They've always tried to make sure that they've always had the most colorful and the brightest displays on any flagship smartphone out in the market right now. But Apple did technically beat them out in the brightness department this year. The 15 Pro is capable of reaching up to 2000 nits peak brightness, while the S23 Ultra is only able to go up to 1750. That being said, Samsung is supposedly planning to beat out Apple again this year with a 2500 nit display. Now obviously you probably wouldn't use displays this bright indoors, and they're not really made for that kind of thing, but something like this would definitely be a lot more useful outdoors. And considering how reviewers have found the iPhone 15 Pro to be a lot more pleasing to use outdoors than before, with its 2000 nit display, then a 2500 nit display would be a nice bump up from that, and also a little bit of a reassurance. But as far as displays go, that's not the only way Samsung will be imitating, or in other cases trying to beat out Apple this year. Lately, rumors have been swirling around of the S24 Ultra increasing in width from 78.1mm to 79mm, and people have speculated that this may actually be because Samsung is going to be switching from a curved display like it has on past models to a flat display. This would make sense considering that the S23 Ultra had less of a curve than the 22 Ultra, and considering that it's less prone to accidental touches as well as breaking when you drop it, this would be a pretty significant upgrade. Now, one feature that Apple introduced a couple years ago with the iPhone 14 Pro is satellite connectivity, and it's something that they've expanded on with the iPhone 15 Pro. Effectively, it would let people get some kind of assistance from pretty much anywhere, even if you don't have a cell signal. After Samsung announced the Galaxy S23, they also announced that they too were working on satellite connectivity, and there have been rumors that they might actually bring it to the S24 Ultra this year. But there are a couple of caveats to this. First off, Samsung said that the new modems for satellite connectivity would be directly integrated with their Exynos chipsets, which are their own custom-built chips, kind of similar to Apple's A series chips for the iPhone. But the thing is, as we'll discuss in a minute, Samsung may not be using their Exynos chips on the Galaxy S24s this year. And second of all, even if they did implement this, they would also need to partner with some kind of satellite provider in order to provide this feature. Apple, for example, partnered with Globalstar, and Samsung would probably need to do something similar if they want to add this feature as well. Now, something that Apple was especially proud of this year was the A17 Pro chip that they put in the iPhone 15 Pros. Effectively, it would allow for things like better gaming experiences, as well as hardware-accelerated ray tracing. The thing is, Samsung's own in-house chips haven't really been the most well-received by customers. The thing is, they're not quite as powerful or as battery efficient as the Qualcomm chips that are used in the US version. That being said, the Galaxy S23 was the first to skip out on Samsung's chips, and if you live outside the US, you may be happy to know that Samsung is potentially planning to move forward with this for the S24s as well. Now, shifting gears a bit, one of the more controversial decisions made was dropping the 128GB model on the iPhone 15 Pro Max. Effectively, this raised the base price from $1099 to $1199, which is technically the same price as the 14 Pro Max with the same storage option, but it also means that the base price is a bit more than it was last year thanks to the lack of a cheaper option. That being said, Samsung also starts at $1,200 for a 256GB model, and if the rumors are true, not only would Samsung be introducing a 2TB model with the S24 Ultra, but they'd also be releasing a 128GB model, which could go one of two ways. On one hand, Samsung could introduce the 128GB model as a more affordable option to make it a bit more accessible to people, while still keeping the 256GB storage option at $1,200. But on the other hand, Samsung could also be dropping that storage option for the $1,200 version. In other words, they may end up selling the $1,200 version with 128GB of storage, and if they did that, that probably wouldn't go over quite as well. But I think one of the points that can be brought up from all this is that both Apple and Samsung are kind of starting to get a bit more aggressive in their competition with each other. Because when Apple announced the iPhone 15 Pro lineup, they made it pretty clear that they wanted to take the Pros in a bit of a different direction. And a lot of the things that Samsung's trying to compete with is tied to this sort of new vision that Apple has for the iPhone. If you want to learn more about that, be sure to go check out this video next right here, and I'll see you over there. Adios. I intended for this video to be just pretty much another recap of the iPhone 15 event that took place on Tuesday. What was interesting is that I was going through my notes and I realized that it wasn't just the products that were sort of the main focus of the event, but rather from the products that were at the event and the things that Apple's been coming out with for things like iOS 17 and even products from previous years. It seems like Apple is focusing on a few new things going forward. In other words, it seems like they're kind of setting new standards for what they want to focus on in the future. So in this video, I want to break down 5 different things that Apple seems to be wanting to focus on for future devices, starting off with the next generation of wireless connectivity. So in recent years, Apple seems to have really been trying to upgrade the way that smartphones and other devices can connect with each other. On the iPhone 11 lineup, we had Apple introduce new ultra-wideband chips for more precise location finding, and then with the iPhone 14s, they brought satellite connectivity, so you could pretty much just contact anyone from anywhere. But with the iPhone 15, it seems like Apple Apple's going to be taking that even further. They're expanding satellite connectivity to allow for roadside assistance, and they're upgrading ultra-wideband so that other people can help find each other through Find My. And even iOS 17 is starting to incorporate some new features like name drop and upgraded iMessaging and check-in and other features like this that help to not only keep devices connected with each other, but also the people that use them. And one of the big things that people use to stay connected with each other is, of course, the iPhone. But over the past few years, Apple has been kind of going on a weird tangent with its naming scheme. With the iPhone 11s, they first brought on the Pro name, which at the time wasn't really a signifier of anything that it was actually Pro. Even though it had the Pro name, it wasn't actually a Pro device. In other words, a device made specifically for professionals. And that stayed kind of the same thing for the next few years up until the iPhone 14 Pro. And I say up until that point because it seems like with the iPhone 15, Apple is really wanting to change things. During the keynote, Apple had two very different perspectives when they came out with the iPhone 15 and the 15 Pro. When they came out with the iPhone 15, they seemed to focus a lot more of the features and also the terminology for just average users. They introduced 48 megapixel cameras from the Pros, as well as things like USB-C. But the thing is, compared to the iPhone 15 Pro, the USB-C port is also less powerful. But by comparison to the 15 Pro, the 15 seems to have a lot more features that maybe Apple seems to consider that maybe people wouldn't really use as much compared to the 15 Pro. For example, the average consumer would probably be a little less likely to use things like external storage devices and things like that. I'm not saying that they wouldn't use them, but they would probably be more likely to use their USB-C ports for charging. Whereas with the 15 Pro, this is where they started to really shift their focus a bit, because rather than just use terminology that just the average person would understand, they started to incorporate a lot of things that seem to be specifically designed toward professional photographers and videographers, and even calling these people out in the keynote. And they were talking about things like color grading and focal lengths and recording directly to a Mac or to an external storage drive and having faster USB speeds. Things like this would be very appealing to a professional, but because in the past we never really had much of a difference between the regular models and the Pro models, and the Pro models themselves weren't really Pro devices, Apple seems to really be wanting to change this going forward. And this seems to be going a bit further when we start looking at the chipsets themselves. So while the iPhone 15 has the A16 Bionic, the iPhone 15 Pro actually has an A17 Pro chipset. What's interesting is that even though A17 Pro signifies that it's the better version of the A17 chip, there actually is no A17 chip. Why is that important? Well, I think that may actually imply that the iPhone 16 next year will have a baseline A17 chip, which may end up incorporating less features than the regular A17 Bionic, and instead reserving those features for the Pro models specifically. And while we're talking about hardware features, let's talk a bit about feature parity. Now, feature parity is something that Apple has been trying to incorporate with its software products, because Apple is not just wanting to sell you one device, they're wanting to sell you multiple, and the ability to have similar features across multiple devices basically helps Apple build a sort of familiar experience across all of its different devices. But most of their focus so far has been on the software side of things, with things like the continuity camera being used for Mac and then bringing that to the Apple TV, as well as things like video conferencing for Apple TV, and then so many other features. The fact that Mac OS is becoming more like iPad OS is becoming more like Mac OS. But since Apple has done this with software for a while now, both the iPhone 15s as well as the Apple Watch Series 9 is starting to show that Apple is wanting to focus on a bit more on this with the hardware side of things. For example, on the iPhone 15 Pro, we now have the titanium build and the action button that we had on the Apple Watch Ultra, and the Apple Watches have the finger tap feature that we first saw introduced and demonstrated on the Vision Pro. And since we mentioned software parity so far, let's also talk a little bit about gaming. So Apple's really been trying to push gaming on the MacBooks for a little while now, especially when they first introduced macOS Sonoma, which should hopefully be coming out later this month. But in the keynote, Apple started to call out a lot of features that were specifically designed, according to them, for mobile gamers. For example, the A17 Pro has a new GPU with a specially designed shader engine, as well as hardware accelerated ray tracing. Basically what that means is it allows apps and games and other programs to have more realistic looking lighting. But beyond this, Apple is also working on trying to incorporate console ports of AAA games directly to the iPhone itself. So basically the iPhone itself would become a much more powerful gaming machine. And beyond all of this, Apple also really seems to be taking the iPhone in a direction that would integrate it directly a bit more with augmented reality. For example, one of the big features that Apple announced on the Vision Pro was the ability to have what they call spatial video, or in other words, just 3D video. video. But with the iPhone 15 Pro, Apple announced that using the ultra wide and main lenses, people would be able to take 3D video straight from their iPhone and view it on a Vision Pro. And even with this, Apple announced that with the new ray tracing features in the iPhone 15 Pro, these would also extend to augmented reality applications and not just gaming. There's one more standard that Apple has held themselves up to for years at this point, and that is app subscriptions. Basically, Apple has been trying to help push app subscriptions to replace the current one-time purchase model, and people haven't exactly been very happy about this. But despite that, I do think that there is a middle point that developers can reach so that both developers and the people who purchase apps can benefit from this. And so go watch this video next to go learn more about that, and I'll see you over there. Adios. Hey Jenny, so it feels like every major tech company nowadays is really trying to get some kind of foothold in the noise canceling headphone space. I mean, Bose really started something back in the day when they came up with the QuietComforts, and since then everyone's just kind of been like wanting a piece of that pie. The noise canceling headphone pie. I don't think I've ever seen two companies go quite at it with each other like Sony and Bose. And there's good reason for that, because Bose kind of lost their space as the #1 noise canceling headphone maker to Sony back in the day. It was back in like, I don't know if you can put an exact date on it because it's complicated. But ever since then, Sony and Bose have pretty much been kind of at war with each other, I think you could probably say, because they definitely have a little bit of a rocky history with each other. There's a time when Bose kind of let their guard down a little bit. It kind of seemed like maybe they were kind of at the top of their game, and so maybe they didn't really need to do much to keep their spot, at least they didn't in their minds. But then Sony came along and pretty much just knocked them off that space almost immediately. And Bose had a bit of a hard time trying to recover from all of that. And I want to make this video because it seems like recently Bose is having a bit of an interesting comeback, or at least they're definitely planning one. So let's get into it. So Bose really kicked things off back in the day when they came out with the original QuietComforts. Those were basically the headphones that kind of launched the whole noise canceling headphone category, at least for just the average consumer. Back then, only pilots had access to this, because that's who Bose was targeting at the time. But then with the QuietComforts, even grandma could have noise canceling headphones and block out the world around her. So that continued on for a while. They came out with a whole bunch of new iterations of it. They kept building on that. And then came the QuietComfort 35s, which I believe were the very first version to have rechargeable batteries. I think that's kind of the point where Bose really started to kind of let their reputation go to their head a little bit. So the 35s came out in like 2016. I believe this was the time that a lot of companies were starting to switch to USB-C on their products. Bose at the time was using micro USB. At this point, Sony was kind of starting to pick up steam in the noise canceling headphone world as well. They came out with the 1000Xs, and then by 2017, they came out with the XM2s. And funny enough, this is also the same year that Bose came out with the 35-2s, which really weren't much of an upgrade over the 35s at all, other than a voice assistant button. To me, this is a bit of like a confusing point in Bose's history, because Sony at this point was starting to pick up some traction. And in fairness, it's not like Bose could just like take a step back and just completely redesign parts of their headphones because one competitor suddenly came out with something. Basically, whenever you have a new product, you have to spend multiple years designing it in order to come out with it at a decent point. At the same time, by the time the 35-2s came out, this was 2017, where companies are really starting to switch to USB-C. Even the XM2s at the time had USB-C, and so the 35s were just feeling a little bit dated. And then that's when Sony basically just came out and dealt a major blow to Bose. So basically in 2018, that's when Sony came out with the XM3s. This was really the one where people were really starting to compare Sony to Bose. At this point, Bose had pretty much just been like the undisputed champion of noise canceling. They were the main one to go for if you just wanted to block the sound around you. And hey, they were quiet comforts. People really liked the comfort of the headphones as well. People could wear them for really long hours of time without having to take them off. The reason why the XM3s were such a big deal at the time is because they were the first headphones that could really properly compete against Bose. They were comfortable. They had really good noise cancellation. Like, these were basically Bose killers in a sense. And people were really excited about them because they felt like a better alternative to Bose while also being more modern. They had USB-C. They had better battery life. They had better noise canceling. Everything that people would have wanted from an updated set of Bose headphones. And then I think that's when Bose really started to take notice, and they tried to come out with their own version of a more premium set of noise canceling headphones. And that's what we pretty much know as the Bose NC700s. So at this time, Bose was trying to come out with this sort of modernized set of noise canceling headphones, also noise canceling earbuds. So they were basically announcing the sort of duology of on-ear and in-ear noise canceling headphones in the NC700 headphones and the NC700 earbuds. This did really well at first, but there were a lot of flaws with it. They weren't as comfortable as the QuietComforts. They basically strayed in a lot of different ways because they were trying to be very much like Sony at the time. Sony had things like touch controls and USB-C and trying to minimize the number of physical controls as possible. And Bose kind of took notice of this and they were trying to come out with their own version of that as well. It's like they saw Sony and they pretty much said,
hey, we can do that too.
And so that's kind of what they did. They basically took a number of the things that Sony was doing at the time and then tried to wrap it up in like this really modern alien looking package. But there were a lot of flaws in the package as well. People weren't a big fan of the touch controls and the battery life was worse and they couldn't fold up like the QuietComforts. They just weren't nearly as comfortable, at least for most people, myself included. And for an extra $50 more than what you would have gotten for a set of XM3s, and for some people they just weren't really as viable an option. And because they were basically just a completely renamed set of headphones, they didn't quite come with the reputation that Bose had spent so many years building up with the QuietComforts. Like, I can see why Bose would want to rename it this time around. I mean, it's basically a whole new set of headphones, but the problem was they weren't building on the past reputation that they had spent over 15 years at this point building up with the QuietComforts, and that's going to come relevant later on once I get past the history portion of all this, but so keep that in mind. But Bose had pretty much just taken all of what they had done in the past and just kind of left it behind in a sense. And then a year later, Sony came out with the XM4s and pretty much took over the Bose 700s in every way possible. And I think at this point, Bose kind of started to realize their mistake a little bit. The fact that they weren't really building on something that people had come to trust. They didn't really feel like an update to the headphones that people had loved for so long. People were really big fans of the QuietComfort 35s. Like, those were go-to noise canceling headphones of the time. But the thing was, the Bose 700s felt so different from that they just didn't really feel like an actual upgrade, even though they really did feel modernized. And a big part of that is because they didn't carry the name and the reputation that the QuietComforts had in the past. And I think Bose really started to realize this because a couple of years later they did come out with the QuietComfort 45s. This was more of like a direct upgrade to the original QuietComfort 35-2s. But the problem was they still weren't really the flagship headphones that they needed to get their foothold back in the noise canceling game Sony had taken from them, because, you know, at this point they were pretty much just kind of taken over in a lot of different ways. And that, my friends, leads us to today's point. Bose is officially bringing back QuietComfort once and for all. They had basically leaked the new headphones that they had been working on, and they were basically going for sort of like a higher end version of what they had been making in the past. Like, I'm talking like maybe even like higher end than the 700s were back in the day. So these were basically dubbed as like the QuietComfort Ultras. They were a really high end version of headphones. It seemed more like they were trying to go after like some category between the Sony XM5s and the AirPods Max in a sense. But what I found interesting was the fact that they were not only going after the QuietComforts, or at least continuing on their legacy, not in just their name, but also very much in the design. But at the same time, they hadn't really left behind too much of the 700s from back in the day. And I say that in a good way, because it feels like they're really taking the best of the 700s plus the best of what made the QuietComfort such amazing headphones in the first place. The portability, the design, the comfort, the fact you can fold them up and take them with you without taking too much space in your bag. Basically everything that made the QuietComforts really good in the first place. But it turns out that with some new information that's been coming out for a while now, I think this first came out like a week and a half ago, but at the time of recording this. But it turns out that this is actually going to be a bit of a bigger thing than we thought at first, because not only is Bose coming out with a new set of headphones, they're also coming out with a new set of earbuds, and they're coming out with an update to the QuietComfort 45s. Now, I don't know if all this is necessarily going to be released all at once. I mean, we had the 700s come out back in the day. Bose came out with the NC700 earbuds a few years later. They came out as the QuietComfort earbuds, because I think that's about the time they realized that they shouldn't have switched from QuietComfort. But it does show that Bose is working on a whole new lineup of headphones, and from what we can pretty much tell, I think Bose is really trying to sort of go after back in that premium noise canceling headphone space. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the QuietComfort Earbuds Ultra or the QuietComfort headphones, so I mostly just want to focus on the QuietComfort Ultras, because that seems to be what we have the most information on right now. So I do have new images that leaked online right now, or not right now, but at least like a few days ago. But it's interesting because back in the day when I made that first video, we only really had some basic renders of what to expect. Now we actually have full-on images of the QuietComfort Ultras. So I think the initial leak said something about these going on sale for like 500 euros, which definitely kind of backed up the whole thing about wanting to be positioned between the AirPod Maxes and the Sony XM5s. But I think at this point, really like the basic QuietComfort headphones will be more of like the Sony competitors, and then these will be more of like the AirPod Max competitors. So if we look at the images that we've had come up over the past few days, it definitely seems like they're kind of going more for like the classic QuietComfort look with the oval ear cups and the nicer headband and everything. So they seem to kind of go for the more metal arm type situation like we had on the 700s, but what I find interesting is the way they've handled it. We've seen a lot of more modern noise canceling headphones go for this sort of free sliding adjustment mechanism versus the classic ratcheting system from back in the day where like you just click them into place. What I find interesting about the way that Bose is handling this is that they're trying to do the same thing, but they've actually managed to integrate the folding mechanism that we've had on headphones in the past. We've actually seen pictures of the QuietComfort Ultras in basically just the classic compact sort of Sony style case where everything's all folded up and tucked in neatly. So it really seems like Bose is trying to go back to the classic portability factor, because the 700s, they had to ditch the whole hinge folding mechanism, and with this they're bringing it back while still keeping a lot of the same benefits. But it does get better because there are also other pictures of the controls and the ports and all that. And so from what we're seeing the classic Bose things. We're seeing a 2.5mm jack on the headphones themselves. We're seeing a USB-C port, and we're also seeing the sort of scoop design that we had on the 700s where they're basically kind of just curved on the outer edges. So what really interested me was this little groove on the right ear cup. So when I saw that, my first instinct was maybe they're doing like a revamped touch control type thing where you can maybe drag your finger on that, and then you have volume control, maybe kind of like the AirPod Maxes where you have the digital crown to adjust the volume. And from what we've gotten from leaks and rumors so far, that actually is the case. So I've also got a couple of buttons on the right ear cup. So one of them has a little notch on it. I'm assuming that's the power button. And then we've got another button at the top, which I'm assuming is maybe like a voice assistant. Maybe it's like a multi-function type thing for like play and pause and all that sort of stuff. And maybe that means that Bose is taking the other touch controls off of the outside of the ear cup. I'm not really sure about that yet, but it does look like that Bose is kind of taking out the whole system where you have the stems running through the sides of the ear cups. Even though with this they're moving back to the classic sort of yoke design where it kind of comes down and then around the sides, which I think kind of makes a bit more sense. But a lot of the control situations do seem to be a little bit up in the air at the moment. We're not really sure if they're going to have full-on touch controls on the ear cups, kind of like the Sonys, or if it's just going to be relegated to the groove on the side and then everything else takes place on like the buttons. We're not quite sure about that yet, but hopefully that will come out in time. There's also these other pictures of the inside of the ear cups as well. It looks like we're kind of going for like the deeper sort of style that we've had on the QuietComforts as well. I have noticed that the 700s weren't quite as deep. I'm kind of getting that same sort of feeling from this, but these do definitely look to be pretty deep, so hopefully these will have that sort of roominess that the QuietComforts had that the Bose 700s kind of lacked a little bit. But other than that, we've had some pretty interesting other developments as well. People are supposedly saying that these are going to be Snapdragon sound certified, which I'm hoping means we're all going to get support for lossless audio over Bluetooth. I'm actually really excited for these headphones. I think these are actually shaping up to be really interesting, and I think these could actually end up being a really great option compared to something like Sony or even Apple at this point. That being said, we really don't know how they're actually going to sound. Hopefully we'll get some more information on that later on, because I think at the end of the day, that's really going to be what sets these apart with along with their noise canceling. But hopefully we will get some information on that in the future as well. That's all I have for right now. Thanks for watching. Feel free to go watch this video next over here. If you enjoy this, feel free to subscribe to become a Jenny. That's what I call my fans, and I'll see you guys next week. Adios.